Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. We are live. I hope you're all doing well. We are live. What are we doing today? Well, we're going to be looking at a mixture of things, really. It's focused on paper one. What we're going to be doing is looking at the extended responses, trying to give you some structure support and indeed content ideas for paper one. As a little added extra, I'm going to throw in some 2 and 3 mark exam style questions for each topic too. We're going to cover each topic in paper one. So it's going to be quite a lot of potentially watching it back, pausing, and indeed trying to take as much from it as you can. But the idea is we're going to try and talk through the type of questions you could get for all sections on paper one. So let's look at topic one, hazardous earth, exam style questions, the 8 mark style question, the case studies that you've hopefully been looking at. Your developed country, Hurricane Katrina, USA, developing Typhoon Haiyan, the Philippines, developed country earthquake, Japan or New Zealand, and developing country earthquake, Haiti. Those are the case studies that you should know very well for those 8 mark questions. Now we're going to go through a number of those paper one exam style 8 mark questions and hopefully give you some ideas of the type of content that you could include. So here's a question for us. Excuse the slightly skewed text at the bottom. Question 1. Remember, these are all 8 markers we're going to be going through. Assess the causes of climate change in comparison to the causes of present-day global warming. Now, that question, imagine I have not put that helpful content above. What you need to be doing is pausing on all of these questions, hiding, maybe even writing the questions down, hiding the extra content I gave you, and then trying to see if you could work out how you would answer this. So my theory on this is we need to be discussing the causes of climate change. It says assess the causes of past climate change in comparison to the causes of present day climate change. Well, that means we need to be talking about the past climate change caused by volcanic eruptions, hotspots, orbital theory, you'll remember doing that, or indeed asteroid collisions, many of you liked discussing that. Whereas you would then contrast that with a peel paragraph on actually what's causing present day global warming is indeed what we refer to as the enhanced greenhouse effect. That is the idea that human activity, particularly linked to our industrialization process, the factories, the churning out of CO2 emissions that's been happening since the last 50, 60 years, really, it's accelerated hugely, which is why we call it the enhanced greenhouse effect caused by humans. And then this idea of the question is asking us to assess. So, and this is quite key here, actually. You know, this is very, very important to be thinking about here. If we're asked to assess, well, you've got to come, especially at the end, to some form of overall assessment. So, which is responsible for climate change? The question is asking you to assess the causes of past in comparison to causes of present day. I would give an overall feeling of, well, what's most responsible for climate change? Quite important to be giving that sense, coming to an answer rather than just sitting on the fence. Okay, let's move on to another question. Again, the content will always be underneath, but please feel free to hide the content. If you're watching this back, pause it. Why not pause it? Read the question. Write your own questions to all of these if you wish. Your own responses, I should say. Assess the reasons why there is uncertainty in predicting future climate change. Again, that sounds like a daunting question, but once you break it down, the reasons why there might be uncertainty. And then again, we're thinking about future climate change here. But there's one very obvious thing here. We're unable to predict pollution. We don't know the levels of pollution that will continue to enhance the enhanced greenhouse effect, will continue to exacerbate that. We don't know if developed countries will limit their pollution. We don't know if developing countries will look for alternative ways of power, try to reduce the levels of pollution. We just don't know. Maybe they will adopt a model that means less pollution as they develop. So that's a key point to start off with, I think, is that we cannot predict pollution, whether that be with both developed and developing countries. Hence the reason why we don't know where the enhanced greenhouse effect is going. Similarly, you might argue that at the moment we've got lots of computer modeling, the technology that tells us about future climate. The problem with that is we do not have the technology, the IT systems that allow us to make accurate predictions of future climate change, largely because there are too many unknown factors. We just simply do not know the way things might change. Even this year, 2023, we're seeing some really interesting record-breaking temperatures. I noticed there's a record-breaking -4, -5 in Australia. We've had plus 40 degrees in Spain in April. There's lots of unknowns we don't know. Why else can't we predict future climate change? You could also argue that the Earth is actually warming up faster than ever before. We don't know how hot it's going to get. Good argument there. Will current warming caused by humans be counteracted by natural causes? Again, we just don't know. So there's lots of points there. You can see even by the bullet points I've put down, there's lots to structure an answer there. And you might even want to come up with, of the reasons you discuss, which is responsible for causing the greatest amount of uncertainty in terms of our ability to predict the future. So you can see what I'm doing with these first two questions here. We're just taking our time, we're having a think, and then we're coming up with a range of points that we're going to discuss. The 8 marker is nothing to be feared. It's just a case of taking your time to come up with 3 strong arguments that you develop. If you can link with the evidence you've done in class, brilliant. Just make sure that you're giving a sense of how important that factor is. Evaluate whether, this is the third question, evaluate whether human or natural causes are mostly to blame for climate change. You can see, don't worry guys, these questions are all largely the same. They're all pulling on the same climate change knowledge. Learn your natural causes, learn your human causes, i.e. the enhanced greenhouse effect and everything that comes with that. And these questions are pretty easy. Again, this one, human causes, you're going to talk about what we talked about in a question before, enhanced greenhouse effect. Natural causes, you're going to talk about some of the factors we mentioned before as well, volcanic eruptions, sunspots, orbital theory, with some sense of evaluation as you go about why one might be more to blame than another. And then at the end, yay, these are all the factors I looked at, this is the most important, this is the least. Yes, I have evaluated my reasons. That question is easy now because of what we've just talked about over the last 5 or so minutes. Question 4, moving away from climate change questions. The first 3 questions, hopefully you're all saying to yourself, I know what I need to learn for climate change now. I'm learning my human and I'm learning my natural causes, and I am ready to take on any 8 marker that comes up if it was climate change in paper 1. Now we're moving on to our tectonics, and we're thinking about our examples and case studies here. When we're thinking about this unit, we really do need to be thinking carefully about, do we know our case studies? So if you've got time today, just make sure you've got either A3 sheets or mind maps with all of these case studies in it, and you will definitely do well. So here is the question: evaluate the consequences of tropical cyclones on developed and emerging or developing countries. So, developed consequences. If in doubt in a geography question, always think SEEP. S-E-E-P. Think SEEP. Social, economic, environmental, and political. SEEP. S-E-E-P. Now, you might not have to SEEP every single aspect of the idea in your answer. You might only use social, economic, political or social, economic, environmental. But always think, if you're struggling in a geography question like this, the consequences of whether it be earthquakes or cyclones, just think to yourself, what could consequences come under? I will always remember SEEP. I will SEEP it. SEEP it. Social, economic, environmental, political. Say it. Social, economic, environmental, political. Social, economic, environmental, political. You got it. SEEP it. Always SEEP it. So, let's actually get back to the question instead of rapping about SEEP. Evaluate the consequences of tropical cyclones on developed and emerging or developing countries. That tells us we need two case studies to use in this particular question. So we need to use a case study from a developed country and a case study for an emerging or developing country. So let's hit up developed first. We're going to talk about Hurricane Katrina, and we're going to try and think about some of the social, economic, and environmental consequences. Social, obviously not great at all, that 1,833 people died. Environmental, 80% of New Orleans was flooded. And in economic/social, as 1.3 million people were evacuated, many of their places of work were flooded, in fact, destroyed. Many of their houses were destroyed. That is a great little quick run through of social, economic, and environmental factors. Done. Developing consequences, we're going to use the same thing. Social, economic, environmental. Hi, Anne, what were the deaths? How many people were left homeless? Was there loss of animals and farmland? It was slightly more rural, some of the areas here. Did it affect income of people? These are the kind of things we want to be talking about. Then we evaluate what consequences were the worst, because that gives us a sense of evaluation at the end. Well, we will give ongoing evaluation when we give a social reason or an economic reason for developed or developing consequences. We'll go, oh, social was a big factor, but economic was more devastating, or environmental was one of the worst consequences. You know, got to use that evaluative language. 5, assess why some countries are more vulnerable to tropical cyclones than others. Again, pause, think. What countries are you going to talk about here? Maybe you're going to use the Philippines example again. And I've broke this down into 4 main areas here. The capacity to cope. That's a really good phrase. Developing countries have a lower capacity to cope as they have less money to spend on technology that enables them to prepare, predict, and manage the impacts. It's a really good point. It's an economic point then, isn't it? It's their capacity to cope is limited by their economic ability to invest and then manage the impacts. Location, key factor in why some countries are more vulnerable than others. Hopefully you've got a little, for all of your case studies, you've got something that talks about why they may be vulnerable or not to hazards. But location is always an interesting one, especially when it comes to tropical cyclones. If you are low-lying or a coastal area, you are more likely to be impacted by a storm surge and any other flooding. So you get worse impacts if you're low-lying. Another interesting one is that the social aspect here of why some countries are more vulnerable than others. If your country is maybe not investing in education as much, or not a great number of people are able to read and write, that impacts the ability or the vulnerability of a group of people. What I mean by that is, if you're unable to read safety advice, or if there is leaflets telling you where to evacuate and you're unable to read, that's got a huge impact on people's ability to be safe. If they have safety instructions for whether it be a life raft or indeed how to create emergency pack, if you can't read, it makes that harder. And of course, the key command word here is assess. So we need to be thinking about which the factors we're going through is most important in making people more or less vulnerable. So again, hopefully you can Go through all these 8 markers and feel much more comfortable when you come to an 8 marker in paper 1. Question 6, rapidly going through these questions here. Remember, watch back please and pause. Take time over each of these. I'm going through it quite quickly to cover as much as I can in the time, but do feel free to go back and pause. Question 6, assess why some tectonic hazards cause more impacts than others. Again, location. Location, location, location. When you're thinking about vulnerability or impacts that hazards cause, think location. Developing countries, again, less capacity to cope. Just talked about that. Fewer earthquake-proof buildings, fewer emergency services to deal with the aftermath. This is all to do with, if you're located in a developing country, the hazard can have more impact because of the country's ability to invest in a number of these different areas. Also, location is important depending on where you are. If you're in a city, there's going to be more impacts for people. Buildings, if you're surrounded by buildings that could fall, there's significantly more impact going to happen rather than if you were standing out in the middle of a field in a rural area. So location, location, location. 2 different aspects there. We can discuss location. Timing. We discussed this and I mentioned it to my groups at the time because the Turkey-Syria earthquake from a few months ago had just happened. And I said one of the factors that made, and again, try and bring in recent examples. If you can throw in a 2023 example or a 2022 example with a point like this, that would be fantastic. So see something like the Syria-Turkey earthquake happened at a timing that wasn't great because people were in their beds, which meant some of those buildings that just crumpled and collapsed. If it happens through the night or in the early hours of the morning, people are more likely to be in their beds, and that is highly dangerous if people are in these buildings that are potentially going to collapse. Obviously, the next point, why are some tectonic hazards cause more impacts than others? The strength of the earthquake, the strength of the eruption will also dictate the impacts. Weaker earthquakes, I remember, and many of you may have experienced an earthquake. I remember being in Greece and there was an earthquake of about 3.2. In fact, there's an earthquake in Wales, wasn't there, last year of 2 point something. Nobody feels it. It's nothing. It's very, very weak. Whereas what we're talking about in terms of a stronger earthquake, well, that's going to cause more damage. And then remember, always have that sense of assessment running through your answer. I keep saying this. It feels silly sometimes, but take a position. Which factor is mostly to blame for causing a greater impact? Keep doing that when you're doing these questions. 7, you'll see again, there's an emerging theme. You just have to know your case studies here with regards to impacts, vulnerability, and here's one about the management of tectonic hazards in developed and emerging or developing countries. Again, you'll notice it's a lot of the same things I'm going to say. Developed countries have a better capacity to cope. There are more emergency services, they've practiced evacuation drills, more money to repair things faster. That was certainly the case in New Zealand. In the previous point I made about drills and better capacity to cope, buildings that are more earthquake-proof. Japan's a great example of that. And again, the counter to that is you then talk about your emerging or developing country, and again, if it just says tectonic hazards, you can be talking about your earthquakes or your volcanoes. But again, you could go on about Haiyan again here would be a really good one to talk, the opposite to what we just said. Which factors the main reason why developed countries are able to manage hazards? Which of the factors we've just discussed, and you will try and put across which is most important. Evaluate the impact of tectonic hazards on developing and emerging or developing countries. It's the same. Evaluate the impact. Think SEEP again, social, economic, environmental, political. You can contrast this obviously with your developed and developing examples we've been speaking about. What type of impacts include stuff like death, damage, economic costs, injuries. What impacts are biggest and which impacts are worst on what part of the world? Easy. You can see the theme here. And then if you are thinking, okay, I get the 8-mark hazards now, thank you very much. There are 2 to 3 mark questions on hazards that could look like any of these. So do feel free to pause. It's all based on the same things we've been discussing, but feel free to pause this or indeed watch back later and feel free to carry out any of those. But most of the content we've covered in the last 20 minutes should allow you to answer these with ease. Topic 2 is development dynamics, and your case study, where you're asked to have a case study for a developing or emerging country. We are looking at India, which is our emerging country. You also looked at Malawi from a developing country point of view to a lesser extent. Here's some questions. Evaluate, remember these are all the 8 markers again. Evaluate the different ways of measuring development. Easy. Go through a few strengths and weaknesses of at least 3 development indicators. GDP is an obvious one. Is it available for all countries? Is it easy to compare? What are the weaknesses? It's purely based on income, doesn't show inequalities. Within a country, healthcare or education can be different in different areas, different parts. It doesn't tell you that. It gives you a kind of blanket average across the whole country. Could you then do that idea of talking about single indicators of development versus composite indicators? This is where I would then go in and talk about the HDI, Human Development Index, where it takes more than one indicator. That's the flaw using just GDP. If you have things like bringing in primary education, years of primary education, you're bringing in health, and you're bringing in an income figure like GDP, then it's much better. Assess the causes of global inequality. This is quite a good question because you just need to think, okay, why? It's basically asking you why do we have such inequality across the world, and there's a number of factors that I would look at here. This is a very easy question to structure if you get this. Location. If you're landlocked, you have no coastline to trade. Good example you've looked at, Malawi, done. Environment. If you have lack of natural resources to sell, then you are going to struggle because exporting material is always better than having to import lots of stuff. So your economy would be stronger in terms of trade if you have natural resources. Thirdly, you could talk about the historical issues that have led to inequality. A lot of the ex-colonies that were exploited for their resources and their people in the past, that is an issue, and that has caused part of the reason why we have such inequality between countries today. So there we go, easy. This has an 8-mark question, assess the causes of inequality, peel paragraph on location, peel paragraph on environment, peel paragraph on historical context. You are then, as you're giving each peel paragraph, you're going to try and give a sense of how important this factor might be, and then at the end, you're going to bring it together with which one you think is the main cause of inequality. Evaluate the 2 main development theories. You've looked at development theories. This would be not the best question to get, especially if you hadn't learned your development theories. So this is your call. If you look at the revision guide that I gave for this particular unit, all the development theories are outlined there. Rostow, Frank, you remember his core periphery model. And then I would talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each of those. This is your kind of call to go and learn those development theories. You remember doing examples when you were doing development dynamics unit of top-down and bottom-up development. Top-down development is when you have development that's coming from above. In other words, it's those layers of governance, government, or IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, that are pushing a project down, maybe across a large scale to a wide number of people. Bottom up is again different because you're working with the communities, often small scale. Maybe the communities themselves come up with these ideas to develop their area, but they definitely benefit the communities they're located in, jobs for local people, small scale technology that locals can use. You've got a few examples again in your notes. which do you think is best and has the most benefits? Assess the impact of location on the development of a named emerging country. Well, your named emerging country is India. So if you're getting this question, you're going to think about three main areas. The impact of location, coastline, availability of ports. Why is that important? Allows you to trade, import, export. It's also close to important trading routes, which is a similar point but different, such as the Middle East, the UAE, and the Asian tigers of Philippines and Thailand. Climate, another really important impact of location on the development of India. It dictates what crops you can grow and what you're able to export. Again, look a little bit further into your notes on that. However, we can talk about other factors that have played a part, that's not just location. Government policy, India offers low tax for TNCs that want to invest, and as we talked about in a previous question a second ago, historical factors, ex-colony, so they're taught English, which makes India more attractive to TNCs. So location has played an important impact in the development of India, but we could also argue government policy and historical factors also play a part in the development of India. Again, make sure you're giving a sense of assessment at the end and throughout after each appeal. Really useful. I hope you're enjoying me kind of breaking these questions down in such a rapid way. Again, feel free to pause and indeed make notes. Evaluate the role of globalisation in causing economic development in a named emerging country. Similar question. All we've got now is the role of globalisation in causing economic development. So globalisation, you've got to start thinking about what is globalisation. Do I have any examples? Do I know any key terms around that? I'm going to go through some of those quickly. Transport improvements. So obviously your named country again is India. Transport improvements, quicker and cheaper to move between countries. TNCs that locate further afield for various different reasons. But I would say that we can now move, if goods are produced, whether it be textile goods in India, you might be aware of the big textile factories that are there, but also technology improvements. And we think about the English language that we mentioned earlier, the globalisation linked to the English language, which comes from India being an ex-colony, yes, but education is valued highly in India, and especially the English language, which has now allowed firms to come in, TNCs to come in, locate themselves away from their host country, whether that be in Europe or North America. They now locate themselves in India, and we can do exactly what we're doing right now, using digital means to communicate. So if you call a call center for Vodafone or BT, you're going to find that you may well be caught listening to someone in Delhi or another part of India. Use your key language though. We call this outsourcing. So these TNCs have outsourced their services. In the past, you only outsourced contracts for manufacturing, whereas now we're talking about outsourcing contracts for service sector work, call centers, and BT is a good example there. And then finish off again by giving the positive and negatives of globalisation and helping economic development in India. Finish it off, boom, 3 appeal paragraphs, easy. Another really good question. It shows you when you're learning your case studies here, think about the areas we've just looked at. We've looked at globalisation, the role of globalisation, and then just generally what allows India to develop. Again, similar question. I'm showing you these overlapping questions so it puts your mind at ease that you know you need to know the same content. It's just you've got to tailor it to the wording of the question. Here's another one. Assess the impact of rapid economic growth on people in a named emerging country. Your emerging country, India. Positives, jobs, money, higher quality of life, services improve, government gets more tax, education and health improves even more. Negatives, overcrowding in cities. You've got your example there of Mumbai. And you could also argue it creates greater inequality. The rich get rich, the poor get poorer, inequalities increase. Forcefully People are moved from their slums when there's development going on, whether that be new housing estates or indeed new companies that want to move in. You could also argue from a negative point of view, loss of culture. If people are encouraged to speak English with English accents when they're in call centres for BT, Vodafone, etc., you may feel that their language and their culture isn't as good as this one that they're having to act or put on. So think the impact of economic growth has positives, of course, largely economic positives. But you could argue negatives are environmental, overcrowding, and economic, rich get richer, poor get poorer, and then we're going back to another bit of our seep, social, loss of culture. I'm seeping it. Can you see it? Social, economic, environmental, political. If in doubt, seep it. Seep, seep, seep. Social, economic, environmental, political. 8. Assess the impact of rapid economic growth on the environment in a named emerging country. You can see you've just got to know your case study. We've looked at globalisation, we've looked at economic development, we've looked at the impacts of development in general, and now we're looking at the environment. Your named country is India. Positives. What are the positives of rapid economic growth on the environment? Well, because India is engaging in COP conferences, it's part of the G20. It's got a political role in understanding the kind of wider awareness of environmental issues. So economic growth and the political development and gets you on political stages that makes you more aware of the need to maybe look after our environment and change. Negatives though, oh my goodness, it's a fire alarm. Guys, as you can probably tell by the noise, there is a fire alarm going on. I will continue this revision session at another time. From me, Mr. Cunningham, what a calamitous end. From me, Mr. Cunningham, have a good one, take care, adios, ciao, I'm out, fire, fire!